Mic check, 1 2 1 2.
Can we get serious now?
One thing that did happen during the 60s was some music of an unusual or experimental nature did get recorded and did get released. Now look at who the executives were in those companies at those times. Not hip young guys. These were cigar-chomping old guys who looked at the product that came and said, I don't know. Who knows what it is? Record it, stick it out. If it sells, all right. We were better off with those guys than we are now with the supposedly hip young executives who are making the decisions of what people should see and hear in the marketplace.
Success in the music business begins with a dream, a vision. This podcast will give you, the listener, the insight and tools to turn that vision into a reality. Meet the industry professionals who work day by day behind the scenes, helping to make those dreams come true. Welcome to the business side of music.
This is Bob Bender. You're listening to this edition of The Business Side of Music. In the studio with us today, a gentleman I had an opportunity to meet a few weeks ago at a luncheon mixer, I guess we could say. Greg Seneff, who is an attorney of law here in Nashville, Tennessee. His background is quite extensive. Greg Seneff has spent a lifetime involved in music, from his family's roots in barbershop singing to long participation in church and school choirs, to singing and playing drums for garage rock and contemporary Christian bands, to mentoring bluegrass artists. Greg is steeped in music of all kinds. Greg took his passion for music and the creative process and pursued work in the industry, initially as a booking agent, band roadie, radio DJ, music buyer for a retail store, video and audio producer, music columnist, and concert promoter. When he realized that his passion included helping those in creative roles, he went to law school with the sole intent to pursue a career in the entertainment law. Greg first entered private practice, but was sought out by the president of Benson Music Group and hired as that company's director of legal affairs. Greg served in that capacity for over 4 years, though the sale of its parent company, Music Entertainment Group, to then the world's largest music distributor, Zomba. Subsequently, Greg was approached again to serve as Director of Business Affairs at EMI Christian Music Group. He also served as General Counsel for the Gospel Music Association and the Christian Music Trade Association, as a board member with Touchstone Youth Resources Services, as an advisory board member to Christian Activities Magazine, and as a member of the GMA Gospel Music Hall of Fame Committee. Greg is taught as an adjunct instructor at the Delta Music Institute at Middle Tennessee State University's recording industry program, and as a seminar presenter at numerous music conferences. Greg drafts, reviews, and negotiates contracts and licenses, including recording, production, music publishing, management, booking agent, mechanical, synchronization, book publishing, film and video documents, and others, assists in the registration of copyrights, trademarks, and service marks, and engages in litigation for the enforcement of contracts, defense of contract breach claims, royalty and fee collections, fraud, infringement, and other actions related to the entertainment law fields and small businesses. Greg is the producer of Music Law Biz, Volume 1, an educational project for artists and songwriters that contains 13 hours of audio information on 12 CDs and approximately 400 pages of information. The subjects include record contracts, publishing contracts, band partnership agreements, forming a corporation or an LLC, booking and management issues, copyright, trademark, and rights of publicity issues, finances for small businesses, how to pitch demo recordings, and much more. Greg often writes columns and contributes responses to music discussion boards on issues of music business and law. He is the host and co-producer of the podcast Artist Insider. He's also currently planning the launch of his own audiobook publishing venture. Greg, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Appreciate you having me.
No, glad to have you. We always like to get the legal minds involved in the show because there's so much going on. Obviously, one of the things we talked about right before we started the podcast was the Music Modernization Act, which I think a lot of songwriters especially think that's long overdue, and it's taken a while. There's still a lot of meat to that, and it's going to take a little bit for everybody to suss it out and kind of figure out what's going on, and I want to touch on that in a little bit. Let's talk a little bit about, though, you started in the music business. Obviously, your family's roots, go back to barbershop singing. which
Correct.
is unique.
Yes, it is very unique. In fact, my father started singing with a barbershop chorus in Louisville, Kentucky, back when I was very young. He learned about barbershop music. He didn't know anything about it, but he was in a carpool, and he would drive to work to General Electric, Appliance Park in Louisville, and the guy in the back seat would hum to himself and then scratch on a piece of paper, and he thought he was a little off kilter there.
Right.
Until he finally got up the courage to ask him, "What are you doing?" And he said, "Well, I'm arranging music." So he said, "Well, what are you arranging music for?" And he was actually the director of the barbershop chorus at that time. And turns out my dad was joined the year after that chorus won its first international championship. And then my dad went on to have a total of 5 international medals. When I got old enough, I joined, and I have 1 international medal. When my younger brother got old enough, he joined. He has 2 international medals. And my mom was actually a member of a founding member of the Sweet Online Chorus in Louisville. So that's how I got interested in music, going to the barbershop shows when I was a little kid and trying to sing all the harmony parts. But then I joined the choir in church and the choir at school and started playing drums and was in garage.
Yeah, you were in a rock and roll band.
Absolutely.
And that kind of led to being a roadie, I guess, for a while, right?
At one point, yes, sir, it sure did, yeah. But like most good boys, I thought I was a good boy, so I declared a major in religion philosophy, thought I was going to be a pastor.
Okay.
And so I went to Kentucky Wesleyan College in Owensboro, and while I was there, declared a second major in communications, radio, and TV production, and joined a small Christian gospel group that toured some and was helping with all the concerts on campus as the chairperson of the religious activities committee on campus. So I got to meet a lot of Christian musicians that way. So that was kind of my introduction, along with a lot of classmates who knew a lot about Christian music, how I got real interested in Christian music in particular.
What inspired you to become an attorney? That's because that's really kind of I don't want to say a U-turn, but it's definitely a left turn or right turn, Clyde, to get there.
Absolutely. I never saw myself as an attorney growing up, and even up until the time I went to law school, I still never saw myself as an attorney. I had lots of in-between jobs, including carrying boxes at a record warehouse and being a booking agent, some Christian artists. I sold sheet music over the phone. I wound up being the assistant director of media at Asbury Seminary for a couple of years and helped with the Ichthus Festival, and wrote columns on concert reviews and album reviews, that kind of thing. Moved back home to Louisville, was a music buyer for a Christian bookstore and a full-time DJ, radio DJ at the same time. By the time I got to that point, we had 2 small kids, and I was working almost 80 hours a week and was not making any money.
Right.
A person who ultimately became a good friend of mine and later a client, Larry Norman, came to do a concert, and I was driving him and his manager around for in-store appearances and radio interviews for the concert. And at one point he asked me, "Greg, is the job at the radio station, is that a job or a ministry?" And I said, "Well, it's a job. They pay me." And he said, "Well, how much do they pay you?" And I told him. He said, "No, that's a ministry." So I was looking around for something that could pay the bills and I could help raise my children, and started thinking about it and praying about it, and realized that in order to be in the music business, which is what I really felt drawn to, if not called to, you have to have indispensable talent, or you have to have indispensable skill, or you have to start out with a whole lot of money.
Right.
And I knew I could play and sing, but probably not well enough for people to come pay to hear me do that. And I had some skills. I was knew video production, audio production, that kind of thing. But at that point, there were production houses on every corner. It was the MTV generation. And if I started as a cameraman, I'd probably die as a cameraman at that point. So I started thinking about what in my past would help me. And I remembered my broadcast law class, and I had done really well in it. And I realized that that wasn't law school. But I thought, well, maybe some of those friends in Nashville who are artists and writers need help, because a lot of them had complained about not having good contracts or being outright ripped off. And so I actually drove down here to Nashville from Louisville and talked to them. And at that time it was the pastor who had performed our wedding ceremony, Don Finto, Papa Don, as a lot of people know him, and asked them all just very directly, number one, does Nashville need another entertainment attorney? And number two, do you think I could do that? And the feedback that I got on it was unanimous. Boy, you'd be good at that, which I never saw myself as that. I was a long-hair hippie drummer. That's how I pictured myself. So I talked to my wife about it, finally, after all those conversations with friends, and she said, well, let's pray about that. So we did, and my parents were 100% behind us. They lived about a mile from us and said, well, we'll watch the kids if you need it, and so on. And my dad said, well, I didn't go to college, actually, until I was about your age. So I started law school at 30. and went through law school. It was painful. I don't recommend it unless you're called to it.
Yeah.
It's
That is a bit old-ish, I guess you could say.
It
to
is.
start out at law school.
It is. I found that I was considered the old guy in the class,
Right.
which my son is 31 now. So it was interesting to go through that process and relearn how to learn. There's a saying, you need to have a lawyer's mind, and there's neurological studies that show that they actually change a person's thinking when you go through law school.
Mm-hmm.
They help you learn how to be analytical. And being a creative guy was anything but.
Yeah, because now it's left brain versus right brain.
Right. So I learned to go to law school and did fairly well at it. I wasn't top of my class, but I did fairly well at it. But I knew I wanted to move back to Nashville, and God had intervened, at least that's my opinion, and I had actually clerked for a guy here in Nashville one summer. I had commuted down. I was living with some friends. My wife and son stayed in Louisville, and learned a lot that year. And after I got back to law school, I got a letter from one of those guys and said, hey, you want to share office space with us? It was not a job. It was an offer to pay rent, which is probably not the best financial decision I've ever made. But it was a great learning experience because all of those guys are still mentors to me now. And so I'm very thankful for them, for sure. But over the years, I've been very blessed.
We're going to take a little break, but when we come back, we're going to dig into this a little more in regards to the entertainment law world, and especially those realms with music entertainment law. In the studio with us today, Greg Senoff, who's with the Senoff Law Office, sharing his wisdom and thoughts. And you're listening to this edition of The Business Side of Music.
Hey, I'm Nancy Moran of Azalea Music Group in Nashville, Tennessee, and you are listening to The Business Side of Music.
You're listening to the business side of music.
Hi, this is Vinny Rebus, the founder of Indie Connect. Our goal is to ensure that you have the knowledge, the tools, skills, resources, and connections that you need to develop a profitable and long-lasting career in music. One way we do this is through these Business Side of Music podcasts. I'd also like to invite you to check out Indie Connect magazine, our free multimedia online publication packed with practical interviews and advice from music industry experts. Go to www.indieconnectmag.com. That's www.indieconnectmag.com. Let us walk with you and guide you every step of your musical journey.
You're listening to the business side of music.
This is Bob Bender. We're in the studio with Greg Senoff, attorney at law. We're talking a little bit about the music industry, and one of the things that we want to chat about is, you mentioned that the artist has, obviously, most artists have the creative side but don't have the analytical side. A lot of artists, and I know you've run into this, I've run into this, they have that background of creativity, but when it comes to contracts, it's almost as if they're intimidated or they're afraid or they don't know what to do. And so in a lot of cases, they'll just back around it and not implement it until it's too late, and then they find out it's a problem, right?
You're right. And in fact, the entertainment industry is based on what is actually the constitutional provision that talks about reserving rights to inventors. So it's actually in the original Constitution. And copyright is part of that. Copyright is really the foundation for most of the music industry, along with trademarks to a certain extent. Not so much patents, but more recently than the rights of publicity are all intellectual property rights that are part of that. Well, the copyright law is what I call a default law. In other words, it is going to control whether the person who's creating wants it to or not. And oftentimes I'll run into people who will say, well, my co-creator and I, or the licensee and I, have agreed to X, Y, Z, and it was a handshake. Well, the copyright law doesn't operate on handshakes. In fact, the copyright law is very clear, and the rulings by the various courts are very clear, that in order to change rights or ownership or interests, you have to have a written agreement signed by the parties who are trying to alter what
all those involved.
All those involved, Correct. So obviously, or I hope it's obviously, most people who are creative in nature, who haven't got a business background, who don't have a law background, typically don't understand that. One of the reasons it's called intellectual property is because there is no property right in copyright in a physical item. It's the concept that is protected. So for example, if somebody recorded a recording in a studio and they own the copyright to that recording, it doesn't necessarily mean that they own the physical recording, whether that's on tape or a hard drive or whatever it happens to be. The physical ownership is separate from copyright. Well, if you don't know that and you have an agreement that says, well, so-and-so will own the physical master, whether it's a hard drive, etc., and somebody else will own the copyright, then it potentially puts those two parties at odds. So you have to kind of pick through all these things very carefully. So for example, I will go to conferences and seminars or speak to college classes and so on, and I'll talk about, well, what if you and somebody else co-write a composition together, a musical composition, what some people call a song. What if you write it together? What rights do the respective songwriters have? Well, if there's no written agreement, the copyright law assumes that everybody's an equal owner. So it's 50-50, which means that either one of those parties can license that composition any way they want to without the other co-owner's permission. It becomes very frustrating for somebody who doesn't understand that if their co-writer or their co-creator runs off and licenses it in such a way that it takes away the value to the other writer.
Right.
So that's just one thing. Of course, also sound recordings are protected by a separate and different copyright. So a lot of people have the misunderstanding that a musical composition and the recording of that musical composition are one copyright. They're not. They're completely different. So that can cause a lot of heartache later down the line when somebody says, well, I was the producer of that sound recording and I always get songwriting credit. Things like that aren't necessarily true, kind of urban legends, but it becomes very important that people understand how copyrights exist, what they are, what rights they have, what rights they don't have, what's possible to do to, if they want to make a living at it, to exploit. And exploitation is a good concept in business.
Yep.
But to exploit those copyrights in such a way that they can make a living. And so those are some of the things that I deal with. I'll run across an artist who says, well, I recorded an album, and then I'll ask, well, did you have a producer? And, oh yeah, so-and-so, famous producer or supposedly famous producer helped me record this album. Well, did you have a written agreement with them? Well, no. Well, conceptually, they're a co-owner of the copyrights in those sound recordings. Well, at that point, of course, they have a panic attack. And
justifiably so.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So now there's a lot of producers who are very honest, who understand, at least conceptually, that it was supposed to be a work made for hire, which is a new phrase we're talking about now. But essentially, they were a contractor for the artist to create those sound recordings, and they will treat it that way. The problem is that copyrights last for the life of the last surviving author plus 70 years. So when that producer dies, that producer's estate, their heirs, can go after that artist and say, no, we co-own those master recordings.
Right.
So it's not just the intent of the parties either. They may be 100% honest and have a lot of integrity and intend all kinds of things, but without a written agreement, there's no evidence of it. And so that can really cause a lot of problems.
And it's something that needs to be taken care of up front before
Yes.
you ever get started. I know that, I think I talked about this the one day that we had lunch at the event. I had a artist who asked me to do some research and get clearances on songs, and then she went with the producer and they recorded the project. Several weeks later, I got an email from her stating that I think it was the bass player on the project wanted percentages on the album because nobody had issued any work for hire agreements with any of the session players, and this bass player was smart enough to figure it out.
Yeah, and there's a lot of people that will try to leverage their situation to their advantage, whether it's correct or incorrect or moral or immoral.
Right.
And of course, there's no such term as fair in the law. That they beat that out of you the first week in law school.
That's good to know.
Yeah. So fair is whatever the parties agree on. And if the parties don't agree, then the law will dictate what it is. And unfortunately, that's not what necessarily the parties to that arrangement necessarily conceptualized in their own head. So one of the I have a lot of sayings that I tell artists, and one is that if you don't understand what's going to happen, it will happen to you anyway. It's very
good, bad, or indifferent.
Good, bad, or indifferent. And there are a lot of situations where everybody, despite everyone's best intentions and there even a mutual understanding, the law can dictate differently. And that can be a real problem from somebody on the outside looking in. So if it gets to the situation where this arrangement is in front of a judge, all the judge can do is interpret the law. They're not going to interpret people's feelings. They're not, I mean, they will take some look at emails, for example, and that kind of thing. But if it runs contrary to the copyright law, if that's the law that they're looking at, then they're going to go with the copyright law, despite everybody's best intentions, because that's what is controlling. That's what they have to do.
Right.
So it becomes very heartbreaking. I had a young lady who approached me after I spoke at what used to be a huge seminar out in Estes Park, Colorado, and I and another attorney had presented a seminar where we were talking about publishing and songwriting and so on. And she approached me in tears saying that I didn't realize that I had signed away, these compositions, these musical compositions. They've never paid me on them, and I know they sold a lot of them. And it's like, well, 3 years have gone by. They're in the law, most laws, areas of the law have statutes of limitations, and it depends on what the statutes say, federal and state statutes say, determines what that statute of limitations is, and it's the period in which you can sue somebody for violating that law. So, for example, under the copyright law, the statute of limitations is only 3 years, which is an extremely short period of time if you're dealing with a song that kind of grows its own legs and becomes a classic or a standard. But unlike contracts in Tennessee, for example, the statute of limitations for a contract is 6 years. Well, if you're dealing with a contract that deals with copyrights, the copyright law is going to prevail. If it's outside the copyright law, then the contract statute of limitations may prevail.
Sure, makes sense.
But it's better to assume that your rights to that copyright you can only enforce for 3 years. That's another thing that people let go by. Most artists don't like to kill the vibe. So they'll get themselves in a situation where somebody is what I call sweet talking them, tell them how great they are. You're a great performer. You're a great writer. You're this, you're that. And of course, they're going to follow that person around, especially if they have any clout in the music industry. Mm-hmm. And they're going to think, well, this person's my champion. They get me. They appreciate my talent. They're going to do the best for me, those are two different thoughts. They may help you, but that doesn't mean they necessarily have your best interests at heart. So don't fall for the sweet talk. That person, when you come right down to it, if they're going to exploit your rights, they're on the other side of the table from you, at least at some point. They may want you to sell 1 million copies of your record, but they're negotiating for what their split of that is going to be. And so there's lots of wonderfully honest people in the music industry. But at some point, you're sitting down at the table with someone deciding how many dollars are on their side of the table and how many dollars are on your side of the table. Yes, I'm biased, but I think you need an experienced attorney to help you walk through that process and understand it. Unfortunately, too many people get off the bus in Nashville with a guitar in their hand thinking their mama told them they sound like this person or that person, and so sign me up. And the problem is that they walk into a situation and they may have a business background, but because of their artistic bent, they think if they do anything to stick up for themselves, they're going to ruin the chances of their career. They're going to be blackballed. They're going to be,
But that's so important. You need to take a breath, take a step back, and understand this is a business. It's obviously why we call this podcast the way it is. There is a business side to the music industry.
Absolutely. And one of the concepts that I've recently been talking about in the last few years is, especially with the onset of the digital era, is that the music industry has been around since the first guy pounded on a log and then was throwing a chicken leg over the fire. That's the music industry, is that you benefit from creating.
And there's some of that still going on.
And there is. The recording industry is really a fad. If you look at the history of mankind, it's only been around just over 100 years.
Right.
And so recordings, and before that piano rolls, are kind of a fad. So that changes all the time. So I tell people, if you will rely on the music industry more than the recording industry to try to make a career, you're probably going to be better off. Now, certainly the recording industry can be great and can pay a lot of money if you do well, but that's the top 2%.
It is.
Maybe.
Yeah.
So, the odds are that a person, just starting in the music industry is not going to crack that 2%. So it's better to be real strong on the music industry. One of my many analogies is that, if a person can drive a manual transmission, a stick shift car, it does not make them qualified to be an over-the-road truck driver just because they can manage a manual transmission. A truck driver has to know the rules of the road, federal and state. They have to know everything about that whole industry in order to make a living at it. Same thing with a guitar player, a singer, or songwriter. They really should understand the industry in order to make a career out of it. Even if they don't have a business mind, they can get the concepts and hire people who have their best interests at heart in order to help them out.
We're going to take a break. When we come back, I want to dig in a little bit on the Music Modernization Act. We talked a little bit about it before the show, I should say. It's a relatively new bill that's been passed, and I think everybody's still trying to kind of figure it all out and where it works and doesn't work. But let's talk about that when we get back. In the studio today, Greg Seneff, attorney at law, and you're listening to this edition of The Business Side of Music.
Hi, this is Alex Heike, and you're listening to The Business Side of Music.
You're listening to the business side of music.
Wow, I just joined the Music Starts Here community. This is a truly hidden gem for anyone in the music business. Whether you live in Nashville or anywhere else in the world, Music Starts Here is like a GPS for your music career. This is the place to be if you want to get advice and direction from some seriously talented musical people who have been where you want to go. Music news, events, and a great big community with resources for artists, songwriters, musicians, studio and tech, along with music business advice from pros in the industry, all on one site? Make sure you get your free profile now. Go to www.musicstartshere.org. That's musicstartshere.org.
You're listening to the business side of music.
This is Bob Bender. We're in the studio today with Greg Seneff, attorney at law, and we're talking about the music entertainment business and where an entertainment attorney really is beneficial, believe it or not. I know that at one point I was talking to an artist several years ago who had a record deal, and he was almost hyper-focused on, I need to get a manager, I need to get a manager. And I kept telling him, you need an attorney and you need an accountant before you need a manager.
I would tend to agree with that. And yes, I'm biased, but I'll put it this way. An attorney who is hired by the individual has an ethical duty to essentially be a fiduciary for that person. They are that person's advocate legally. So unlike a manager who doesn't have an ethical obligation, they may under the law against fraud and that kind of thing. But it's not the same as an attorney whose purpose is to make sure that that person avoids the pitfalls legally and on a business basis.
Right.
Now, an accountant, a good CPA, has the same type of obligations. But the problem is a lot of times those business managers are hired by third parties and then brought to the table. And so their alliance is with the manager if they're hired by the manager. Same thing for the booking agent. So you have to be careful about that. I do suggest that a person who is approached with a business setup, whether it's being a member of a band or it's producing a record, or it's having a publishing agreement or a booking agency agreement, an endorsement contract, any of those kinds of things, that they have an attorney, number one, who is experienced in the music industry.
And experience, not just in entertainment law, but in the music industry.
Correct.
Yeah.
Because there's terms of art in every area of the law. So, for example, no one should ever hire me to do securities work because I don't do securities work, stocks and that kind of thing, for, a public offering. I just don't do that kind of work. I don't want to do that work, and I'm not well versed in it to really help somebody the way they need to be helped. The same thing with real estate. Now, I do have some experience in real estate law, but that's just happenstance. I would not suggest going to an entertainment lawyer, generally, to help you with a real estate matter.
Because it's something you're not dealing with on a daily basis.
Right.
Right.
And I don't try to keep up with a lot of other areas of the law. I may happen to hear about them. But in the music industry, for example, I have had people who I have negotiated with, and their parents or an uncle or someone they know is an attorney. For example, when I was in-house at the record companies, publishing companies, whose uncle, father, somebody would offer to negotiate on their behalf. And I would use terms like cross-collateralization, which is a very common term in the music industry, and they had no idea what it meant.
Right.
Or they would try to, I don't know if they didn't understand the concepts or they were trying to show their relative or friend that they were going to stick up for them. They would start to try to negotiate points that are extremely well settled in a publishing deal or a record deal, and no record deal or publisher is ever going to change those terms. So you have to find somebody who is versed in the music industry to really help you efficiently. You can find somebody who may want to learn about the music industry, but understand you're going to be paying many more hours for their time than somebody who already understands the ropes.
Let's talk a little bit about the Music Modernization Act. It was recently signed into law.
Right.
It's out there now. What really does it put into effect versus to what was out there before the law?
In large part, it helps protect the songwriters and the publishers in ways that they were not protected before. It tries to deal with the relatively new technology of streaming. When I say new, it's several years old, so for a techie, it's old. But for in terms of...
But the laws weren't in place for that because it didn't exist back then.
Correct.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of concepts in the Copyright Act and the Digital Millennium Copyright Act that were new concepts. So, for example, back just not too many years ago, there was no such thing as internet radio. And internet radio is a digital broadcast, unlike streaming. It is not streaming, it's different. And then there are recordings that are downloads. Downloads are not broadcasts, and they're not streaming. So there's all these new technical inventions, the new way that music is delivered to consumers that were not taken into account under either the copyright law or the digital Millennium Copyright Law, which was passed 15, 20 years ago.
Right.
Were not even thought about at that time. And so this new law, which was put into place, it's been essentially 15 years of negotiation between the songwriters, the publishers, and then the providers of those streaming services to try to find a way where people who are the writers and so on, the owners of those copyrights, can be compensated. As it is, if you're on Facebook and if you follow any songwriters at all, you'll see pictures of their checks from their publishers for streaming, and it might be 4 cents or 25 cents or $1.50, depending on how successful they are, and that represents millions and millions of streams. Whereas if a person bought a physical copy or a download of that particular song rather than streaming it, theoretically, the writer and the publisher share 9.1 cents for every copy that's sold. So you can see if you're talking about millions, you're talking about potentially millions of dollars for that songwriter and publisher that they would split. So it's been a real hit to the music industry, especially on Music Row and the publishers. So this new Music Modernization Act was an attempt to try to deal with situations where those streaming services and the subscription services would have to pay basically the going rate for using the compositions that are in those underlying compositions in those recordings. Now, a lot of the act is not settled yet. There's going to be a number of committees created to try to negotiate blanket licenses for particular services to help protect the publishers and the songwriters. There are some things that the songwriters and the publishers gave up in that law, including a limitation on going back after streaming companies that did not pay them for those streams. So there were some sacrifices, and I would argue in some cases pretty substantial sacrifices made.
Why do you think that was implemented or put in there?
Well, because the streaming services wouldn't come to the table if they had open-ended liabilities.
If they had something hanging over their head.
Right.
Yeah.
So why would they have any impetus to come to the table and negotiate passing this bill or, calling off their lobbyists?
So it's a bit of not only protection for them, but it's a little bit of dangling a carrot to get them to the table.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
Absolutely. So the law is very much up in the air. I mean, the structure is there, but all the operating pieces are not in place.
How long do you think that's going to take?
It's going to take a year or more, probably, depending on the various aspects of it. There's going to be a lot of infighting, too, because on one hand, you think of the publishers and the songwriters being on the same side of the table, but once the money comes on that side of the table, then the songwriters and the publishers are negotiating with each other as to where to split those dollars. So there's going to need to be an equitable representation of the creators, the companies that exploit those creations, and the companies that use those creations in order to get them out to the public. And it's going to take a while to get it all sorted out. Fortunately, there's the mechanics are in place so that it can change over time. Mm-hmm. As music hopefully becomes more valuable again. Essentially, it has very low value now because you can stream anything you want without having to pay for it.
Right.
But as that license rate goes up and some of those providers start having to charge for enjoying that music, it's going to change.
Which is only fair.
It's only fair.
Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yep, I agree.
We're going to need to get you back about a year from now to be able to look a lot deeper into this, I think. But before we let you go, I do also want to touch on something else here. You're the producer of Music Law Biz. It's an educational project for artists and songwriters. You said it contains 13 hours of audio information on 12 CDs and 400 pages of information. Let's talk about that for a minute.
Sure. Well, I have spoken over the years at a number of conferences and seminars, and one of my buddies, Tom Jackson, and I have been at a lot of seminars together. He and his wife and family I'm pretty close to, and I'm very thankful for them. But after one of the sessions that I did that he attended, he said, what you do isn't sexy to most artists and songwriters. They kind of come here because they're scared of things rather than they're excited about how they're going to be a better songwriter or performer or whatever it is.
Right.
He said, what you need to do is what I do, which is offer a product that they can take home and kind of digest over time. And so I thought about that, and at first I thought, well, this will be a couple of cassettes. I mean, that's how long ago we're talking.
Right, yeah.
As time went by, I started talking to other friends in the music industry, producers, writers, A&R people, publishers, and so on, and started talking, and they said, that's a really good idea. So it even got to the point where I thought, well, the people that buy this project really need some help financially too. So where's the best resource for that? I actually got Dave Ramsey to be interviewed on this project. And of course, he, being in Nashville, has dealt with a lot of people who are in the entertainment industry,
and has millions of followers through Financial Peace University.
Absolutely,
Get it? Yeah.
So when I told him about it, in fact, I called his office, and the assistant there said, "Well, he's asked to do these things all the time. I don't think he'll do it because if he accepted all of these requests, that's all he could do." And so he called me back in person the next day, and I was a little shocked. And he said, "Tell me about this." And so I told him. He said, "Well, I think you're trying to help people, so I'd be happy to help you with this." And he was a big help. It's amazing how many people think about being this successful songwriter or artist, but they never think about what it's going to take to hold on to that money if they ever are successful. Well, you have to start before the money actually comes in the door.
Yeah.
To really be successful with money matters. And so he sat down with us. So I also had a dear friend of mine, John Mays, who has been both A&R and has run record companies, who's been very successful. He's looked at as kind of the mentor to the industry to a lot of artists and songwriters. Great guy, and funny too. If you ever get a chance to see him speak, it's well worth your time. A number of writers, Grammy-winning folks. So I'm very thankful for the opportunity to have interviewed them. But a lot of the documents that are available there are samples. They're not intended to be used as forms because every situation is different.
So they're not templates per se.
They're really not designed to be that. I don't suggest that people use them. They're to give people a concept of what these documents are going to look like when they come through the mail,
right,
or over email. And my intent was to give concepts in those documents. So I have a lot of commentary in those documents. What a work made for hire document looks like, what a producer agreement looks like, what a publishing contract looks like, as well as a lot of bibliography in their books and other resources, copies of Copyright Office forms and that kind of thing so they can look through it. And one of the things that a lot of people have asked me to do over the years is to help them file their copyright registrations. And I will usually say, well, I'll help you with it, But once you've done it once or twice, you'll go, why did I need you?
Right. Yeah, exactly.
So I don't typically charge a whole lot for helping people do that, but I typically don't do that for them just because I think they need to understand their business.
But this will help, right?
This will help. Yes, absolutely. It has some of the copyright circulars in it that they can read through. And so that's why I did the project. It's kind of it's a work in progress. I hope to have it on Amazon so the audio's available for download. I honestly will probably never put the documents online for download just because people will try to use them and say, well, you said these were okay. No, they're not okay.
Yeah. It's just a reference.
It's just a reference, exactly.
Right. Yeah.
And the music industry changes too fast these days to just take something off the internet. And that's another warning that I give people. If somebody's starting a record company or a publishing company and they pulled all their forms off the internet, beware. That negotiation is going to last a lot longer.
Yeah, it absolutely is. How can people order this?
They can contact me through my email, which is MID, as in dog, TN Law @gmail.com. Stands for Middle Tennessee Law, so mid-TN Law.
That's the best way to get a hold of you.
That's the best way.
Great. Greg, thanks for being on the show. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
As a listener, you know that the Business Side of Music podcast is free. But in order to keep it running, consider becoming a patron of our show. You can do this by going to our Patreon page on our website, which is www.businesssideofmusic.com, and click on Support the Podcast button. When you become a patron of our podcast, you'll have access to material that you won't be hearing on our regular shows, insight from industry leaders that is designed for our patron members, and have the ability to purchase the Business Side of Music merchandise that you can find on our website at a discount.
The Business Side of Music is the creation of Tom Sabella and Tracy Snow and is produced by Bob Bender. Co-producer for the show is Vinny Rebus. The Business Side of Music is recorded at Music Dog Studios in Los Angeles, California and Nashville, Tennessee. Production sound design by Keith Stark. Voiceover and promo by Lisa Busan.